Before I do start this video, make sure to use my TCG player affiliate down below if you're looking for any of these singles that I talk about today. Also, this channel is sponsored by Arcane Fortress. If you're looking for the best deck boxes around, make sure to use my link down below in the description to check them out. One other way you can support the channel is by becoming a patron. There are some great benefits of being a patron to the channel, such as giveaways, deck advice, and more when you do join. Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Devin coming back at you with another video today on PubStomp MTG. With Modern Horizons 3 coming out to Magic the Gathering, there's a new card that I'm quite excited to talk about with the Necrobloom. This is a pretty sweet card, has a heavy reference to Plant vs. Zombies, that one mobile game that everybody was obsessed with a long time ago. Maybe people are still obsessed with it, I'm not sure, but instead of the Plants vs. Zombies, it's going to be plants and zombies against your opponents. Before diving into my thoughts about it, let's read what it does first. So for 1 white, black, and a green, it's a legendary creature plant. It does have landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 0/1 green plant creature token. If you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token instead. And it does have the ability land cards in your graveyard have dredge 2. So basically you may return a land card from your graveyard in your hand and mill 2 cards instead of drawing a card. So this is just a pretty heavy reference to Field of the Dead. It has basically the same kind of text. If you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. And obviously Field of the Dead's going to go into the deck, no question about it. I just wanted to point out the similarities. But essentially getting that redundancy to put a lot of zombies on the battlefield is going to be pretty crazy. You're going to overwhelm your opponents so easily. Not to mention that this has a huge butt on the battlefield. It's going to block all the Colossal Dreadmaws for you. Outside of that, at first I wasn't too excited about that first part. Landfall is a pretty common archetype you can see in a lot of different situations, but the fact that land cards in your graveyard have dredge 2 make this extremely powerful. So there are a lot of situations where we could take advantage of that first ability, and of course we can take advantage of landfall because, I mean, putting a lot of creatures on the battlefield, going wide, and then swinging away for victory is going to be a pretty common theme with this deck specifically. So with that said, let's get into the deck tech. Let's talk about some subjects and some things that you may want to consider when building the Necrobloom. I do want to talk about getting lands in and out of the graveyard. There's a lot of different options we could take advantage of that with. Something as simple as a crop rotation can get our game plan going, tutoring for the right type of land to put it on the battlefield to get 7 different types so that we could trigger our commander, all the while putting another land into our graveyard that we could dredge later on. In a similar fashion, we could take advantage of Roiling Regrowth and Entish Restoration. These early game options can ramp us ahead a little bit. Of course, if we do have a creature with power 4 or greater on the battlefield, we could get more lands with Entish Restoration. These mainly provide us that option where we could just sacrifice a land, put it into our graveyard so that we could just return it by dredging it with their commander, and then getting more lands on the battlefield. There are some options similar to these where we just sacrifice lands and get more lands on the battlefield, but I do want to also recur them from the graveyard to the battlefield. Conduit of Worlds and Crucible of Worlds will get the job done for you. These will provide you a constant way where we don't have to worry about just having those cards sit in the graveyard. We could just return those lands from a graveyard to the battlefield just to get extra land triggers. Speaking of extra land triggers, Oracle of Moldiah and Dryad of the Elysian Grove will get the job done for you too. There are some similar effects like this, like Wayward Sawtooth and Exploration, that are in the deck list, but I wanted to focus on these mainly because Oracle Moldiah does give you that option of looking at the top card of your library, and you can play lands from the top of your library. So if you have 2 lands on top of your library, you could just play one after another. Plus, if there's a really good card on top of your library that you do see but you don't necessarily want to mill it with your commander, you don't have to because you already know the information. And the same kind of effect can be said for Dryad of the Elysian Grove, playing an additional land, and of course you could tap for basically any kind of mana you need in that situation. You don't have to worry about mana fixing as much. Speaking of getting extra land drops, if we do have a bunch in our graveyard, Splendid Reclamation can be a house for us. Return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So whether we're dredging with our commander, milling a lot of lands into our graveyard, or if we're sacrificing them with those Roiling Regrowth effects, this will absolutely provide so much landfall triggers so that we could overwhelm our opponents with a bunch of zombies, or depending on what kind of lands they are and how much lands you do have that are different, you get a lot of plant tokens. Now I do want to shift the focus and talk about land engines. What I do mean by engines is the fact that there's a lot of cards individually that will definitely give you a lot of options outside of just lands, but they do synergize with them as well. An example of that would be Wrenn and Realmbreaker and Wrenn and 7. First, taking a look at Wrenn and Realmbreaker, it does color color fix you with that static ability. It does have 3 different modes. You can make a land into a body with that first option. You can mill 3 cards and put a permanent card from the milled cards into your hand with that -2 ability. And most importantly, with that -7 ability, you get an emblem. You may play lands and cast permanent spells from your graveyard. Now this is the type of engine we do want to see in this deck, where we can mill constantly with that -2 ability. Of course, we do have to +1 it a couple times so it doesn't die. But I will say Ren and 7 is probably a better option. Even though it's 2 more mana, it does have 4 different modes. The first one is money. Reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put any land cards revealed this way into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. And let's just say you have a lot of lands in your hand. You could take advantage of that 0 ability, put any number of land cards from your hand onto the battlefield tapped so that we could get a lot of landfall triggers off of our commander. And depending on the number of lands you do have, you could make a big giant tree folk creature. And the last ability is pretty nuts. Return all permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. You get an emblem with you have no maximum hand size. That is great, but most likely we're going to be using that +1 ability a lot more than those other abilities. I mean, if you get to the ultimate, that's pretty good. So these are easily cards that you could throw in, and they'll be great engines for your deck. Other engines that you can take advantage of is both versions of Gitrog, Thalia and the Gitrog monster, and the Gitrog Ravenous Ride. Thalia and the Gitrog monster acts as a great stacks piece, and you can play additional lands on each of your turns, and also you can sacrifice a creature or a land. So if you want to sacrifice one of those saplings or zombies, or even a land, you could easily do so when you do attack with Thalia. And because you are making a lot of tokens, the Gitrog Ravenous Ride, you could just saddle them up and then just sacrifice them to get some decent lands on the battlefield too. So these are good, but if you want a really good synergy with your commander, look no further than the Gitrog monster. This is easily going to be the best engine in the entire deck, mainly because of the Gitrog monster's last ability. Whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, you draw a card. And when you look at that, land cards in your graveyard have Dredge 2 with the Necrobloom. Everybody knows how busted Dredge is with the Gitrog monster, and so having that ability to basically draw a card instead mill 2 cards, and if they were lands, you have that trigger with the Gitrog monster to draw cards, but because of that Dredge ability, you could go back and forth, and as long as cards are land that go into the graveyard, you could basically dump everything in there. I mean, of course, it will probably stop at one point, but once you get the engine going, it's gonna go absolutely nuts. But of course, the biggest thing about this deck is the fact that there's going to be so much lands entering the battlefield. There's so much cards that do have landfall that are going to be nuts in this deck. You could go wide and you could buff up your creatures by using Felidar Retreat and Maja Bredegard Protector. Every time a land enters the battlefield, you make a 2/2 or you'll make a 1/1, but most importantly, you could either choose the option with Felidar Retreat by putting +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, and Maja basically is an anthem for all your creatures too. Another way you could buff up your creatures is by using Bristly Bill. On landfall, you have that ability of putting a +1/+1 counter on target creature, whether you want to put it on Bristly Bill or your commander, and plus you could pay 3 and 2 green and double the number of 1/1 counters on each creature you control. Of course, if you have a lot of landfall triggers and you have a lot of mana lying around, you could just keep doubling the number of 1/1 counters and possibly go for the win there. I would also recommend Elvish Snore, Mother of Machines, and really any kind of Panharmonicon effect. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent controller trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. That does include lands entering the battlefield triggering your creatures. Not only will this double the landfall triggers you control, but this will also negate your opponent's ETB creatures, or really any kind of ETB in general. This will probably come as no surprise, but Avenger of Zendikar, yeah, just put this in the deck. It's going to be a win con in the deck. Whenever it enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land you control, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature you control. But I will say this does actually have synergy with our commander, because our commander will make plant tokens on the battlefield, so we could just buff those up with Avenger of Zendikar. So it's not just a card for landfall, but it does synergize with our commander too. And I'm really not going to beat around the bush on this too much, but of course, at Craterhoof Behemoth, it's going to be a win con in your deck. If you're putting so much creatures on the battlefield, you're just going to win that way, or at least put some kind of overrun effect where you put trample on your creatures. And I really didn't want to talk about landfall too much, because landfall is pretty common in EDH. A lot of people know that strategy. If you look at a lot of landfall creatures on EDH Rec or otherwise, you'll see that there's going to be a lot of synergy with that in your commander. But with that said, that's going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on the Necrobloom. I do have a full deck list down below in the description if you want to get a more detailed look at what's in the deck specifically. It is pretty cool to see another Abzan commander. I feel like this is like the least popular like 3-color combination that I've seen. Not a lot of them come out every so often, but when they do, they're absolute bangers, like Thalia and the Gitrog monster and now the Necrobloom. But let me know down below in the comments, do you plan on building this? What are your thoughts and opinions about this? Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. With that out of the way, thank you for stopping by.